Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today we're jumping into some malicious compliance. Our first story today comes to us from Renee Becker. Travel additions adding up. Let's jump right in. In the late 90s of the last century, while I was still working at the international organization, things at the office deteriorated a bit. People were rotating in and out of the office, and my manager was one of them. The specimen that became my new manager was what my grandmother, with a knowing glance, would call special. Entitled and superior, according to himself. Let's call him Frank. We did wholeheartedly agree on one thing though, the dislike we had for each other. One of the tasks I had assumed was head of protocol for my boss, the High Commissioner. This basically means that I had to ensure that he was treated according to his station, with all rights and privileges awarded to him as an international dignitary. Oh, and I had to look solemn. Our office was working closely together with a number of NGOs on several issues. We would make policy and they would implement it on the ground with projects, etc. One of the NGOs was organizing a conference where we would connect policymakers with international legal experts. The object being, international experts don't bite, don't try to invent the wheel, call them. The director of said NGO visited us often, and we got along like a house on fire, much to the annoyance of Frank, who thought I didn't know my station. So when High Commander was asked whether I could assist with the organization, High Commander agreed immediately. I built up somewhat of a reputation in that field, so it wasn't considered strange. So far so good. I helped arranging the hotel, drivers, interpreters, liaised with various ministries and experts. The NGO got used to calling me at all hours, weekdays and weekends, to check or discuss things. I didn't mind. I worked my proverbial butt off. We had rented conference rooms in a 5-star hotel in Vienna. The police would supply security, the airport would receive the guests, and all people would be staying in the same hotel. The only thing was, due to agenda restraints of various participants, the conference would start on Friday and end on Monday. Everybody assumed, me included, that I would be there. There was one detail I had forgotten: to ask Frank's permission. I needed to have a form signed to authorize my travel, otherwise I wouldn't get paid for working, much less traveling there. On a Monday morning, I walked into Frank's office and dropped the blank authorization form on his desk, with as neutral a look as possible, trying to pass it off as an annoying detail. "Sir, concerning the conference, could you sign the document for approval? I know it's a bother, but you know, please." He picked it up, looked at it, and, holding it, checked something on his computer. "This conference isn't organized by us, but by the NGO?" "Correct, the boss is a guest." "So the rooms and travel are paid for by the NGO?" "Correct." "So you'll be a guest? You may go. I'll grant you the Friday and Monday as paid leave, and nothing else." He filled in the authorization form, signed it, gave it to me, and gave this little wave that you use towards servants. "That will be all." You have to be effing kidding me. I stood up, kept my jaws as clenched as my fists, and walked out, fuming. Getting back to my office, I was met with one of the policy advisors who wanted to discuss the details of one of the meetings. I think I radiated an air of dejection because he asked me what was wrong. I told him, "You can't accept that." I shrugged. "There's nothing much I can do. He is my manager." As he stood up, he said, "Well, we'll see about that." I went about my day and managed to push it to the back of my mind. A few days later, I was called into the High Commander's office. Sitting behind his desk with papers piled up in great stacks, he never learnt computer. He was talking with the director of the NGO, who was sitting opposite him. They seemed very relaxed. High Commander looked at me and smiled. "Ah, have a seat. I gather you'll be working with us in your spare time?" I nodded. "Yeah, Frank didn't give me authorization." "Well, correct, and I will not change one iota, as he is your manager. I have to respect his decisions regarding his own staff. Otherwise, I'll undermine his authority, and I can't have that. I am sorry, but my hands are tied." The authorization stays unchanged. It is a bit of a conundrum, really, as I gather you are working day and night on this. I nodded again, and wondered why they called me in to state the bleeding obvious. In the silence that followed, the director let out a chuckle, and then the High Commander started smiling. He grabbed a form from his desk and looked at it. What followed next was the most astonishing monologue I have ever heard. Not because of the eloquence, but because of the implications. We had ordered you a plane ticket, but we have just decided that we need you to bring some supplies. So you will be going with your own car and will be reimbursed a first-class train ticket with sleeping quarters. As the supplies you will have to bring take up some space, we have decided that your room will be upgraded to a suite. Can't have you tripping over everything now, can we? Oh, and I understand it is quite heavy, probably too much for you to carry alone. Would your girlfriend be available that weekend to assist you carrying the supplies? We will reimburse her travel and stay, on the same conditions of course. Furthermore, you will get a per diem for 4 days, and as you will be working during the weekend and 2 days of your leave, your salary will of course be increased. Leave days and Saturdays 150%, and Sunday 200%. Now, where do I sign? Oh, and tell your girlfriend that I will be looking forward to host her at my table for the first evening. The director now burst out laughing. After a couple of seconds, he composed himself and added, "Oh, and as you're consulting for us as well in those days, we will pay you a consultancy fee as well. Of course, not a large one, but an administrative fee should do." Listening to this, I had to process what that meant. I would be reimbursed more than an entire month's salary for 4 days' work. But won't Frank protest? I mean, I don't want to get in trouble over this. High Commander looked at me and tried to look as innocent as possible. As far as I am aware, I have completely respected his authorization form, so I'm not undermining his authority in any way. I have just added a new one to it. He continued with a smile that I can only describe as slightly evil. What we discussed here falls under confidential information. You are not aware of this conversation, and I have forgotten I have signed this document. I nodded. In the environment I worked in, you quickly learn to have no active memory of a lot of things. I stood up, walked to the door, and suddenly something hit me. What supplies do I have to transport? The director randomly picked up a slender folder marked Conference with at most 10 pages, reached out and gave it to me. Thought you'd never ask. This, don't drop it, I understand it's heavy. My girlfriend and I had a lovely time, and as she was from Vienna, she was positively radiating, inviting her friends for coffee or drinks at a 5-star hotel suite. Oh, and Frank, he never found out, and up to this day, he thinks he taught me a lesson. Well, it's pretty obvious this person was the High Commander for a reason. It seems like they know how to manage their people pretty well. And for those of you who didn't know, an NGO is a non-government organization, typically a non-profit, but not always. Do me a quick favor, have a look down below the video. If that subscribe button's still red, it means you're not actually subscribed to the KCC channel. Please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Our next story today comes to us from Goldie Matt. Won't pay for my coffee? How about a hotel room, 3-course meal, and breakfast? Let's jump right in. Longtime reader, first-time poster, be gentle. I used to work for a company in the UK, based in London, but with regular travel all around the country. We had very long hours, and we're required to be on site when work began at 7:30 a.m. But you could be hundreds of miles away. You were allowed to stay away, but you had to get approval from a senior manager, usually only agreed through gritted teeth because of the difficult expenses policy and the wrath of the senior manager who approved the expenses. More on this guy soon. I used to get up early, commute all around the country, often doing 2 to 3 hours in the car at a time. Most often stopping to fuel the car or just having a break, usually grabbing some breakfast and a coffee, because I was often leaving the house before it was palatable to eat breakfast. I was young and conscientious, so would buy my own breakfast, but buy a coffee separately and keep the receipt for expenses, usually a 5-pound breakfast and a 3-pound coffee. Our expense policy allowed me to put the whole lot on expenses, but I was conscientious. Anyway, after months of this, I submit my expense claim. My immediate manager approves it without batting an eyelid, as he can see the addresses on the receipts and the timestamps. So once a manager has approved it, the expenses would go to one senior manager to approve, for maybe 200 to 300 claims a week. Major trust issues and seriously backwards. One morning, early at head office, the senior manager comes into my office and tells me to follow him. I follow him to his office, where he explains to me that the company isn't here to buy me effing coffees. Long story short, I'm told to stop playing fast and loose with the expense policy. I wasn't, and follow the rules. Here is the malicious compliance. Speaking to HR, they had a policy about work-related driving, an EU working time directive, which meant that all the early starts and late finishes had to stop immediately because it was breaching policy and the law. So the next time I had to be on site for 7:30 and was 2 to 3 hours away, I stayed in a hotel the night before, 3-course meal and breakfast, all in line with the expense policy and working time policies. This continued for about a month because you can only submit expenses for payment in the last week before payday. My expenses went from £100 a month to £1,000 a month. Expenses submitted, manager approved, sent to senior manager. I get a phone call to come to HQ the next day for a talk with the senior manager and HR. The following day I attend, get an absolute roasting. What the F did I say? Who do you think you are? When I could get a word in, I explained how I was traveling in line with company policy, health and safety legislation, whilst also complying with the expense policy to the letter. HR confirmed nothing he could do. Needless to say, the policy was changed some months later. I felt much better because I was well rested, fed, and working the hours I was being paid for. One of the best things you can do to cover your butt in a company is to know their policies inside out, because if you've even read through them once, you probably know them better than most of the managers there. Our next story today comes to us from Waste Isopod 3368. Call the police? Sure, let's jump right in. In our mid-20s, my husband and I purchased and moved into our rather modest first house with our infant daughter. I made a big effort to meet and befriend our neighbors, and all of them warned me to be careful of one particular person, Jane. Jane had lived in the street for 3 years at this point and had earned herself the nickname Big Fat Jane, as she was manipulating, intimidating, and thoroughly awful. Jane ran a daycare from her house, but neighbors on both sides reported hearing her scream at the children and leave them unsupervised in the garden. It's important to note that Jane's partner is a police officer. The neighbors were scared of retaliation if they reported her or stood up to her. It seemed Jane would use this to get away with her horrific behavior. Our house had a driveway with a dropped curb big enough for one car, but we could fit both if you blocked in the first and only used the second car. Parking on the street was very limited, and we had double yellow lines outside our house, not allowed to stop or park there. During some essential roof work, our driveway was taken up by scaffolding and a skip, so we parked in the street and my husband parked outside Big Fat Jane's house. The next day when he went to his car, Big Fat Jane came running down her path shouting at him. She screamed about his antisocial parking, that his car would be towed, and that he could expect it to be scratched up if he left it there any longer. My husband calmly explained it was a public road and she had no right to police the space. Her screeches at this point were loud enough that I and several neighbors heard and came to see the commotion. Her partner was perched at the door during all of this, saying and doing nothing. When she saw me on pavement with our daughters, she pointed and screamed, "You'll have the social on you if you don't F off. I'll scratch you right up." At this point, I told my husband to come back and we were calling the police. She responded, "Call the police. I effing dare you. He's," pointing at her partner, "a policeman. He'll effing sort you out. You won't know what hit you." At this point, my husband looked at her husband and said, "Is that right? And you're agreeing with what she said?" The partner nodded and said, "You need to move or accept the consequences. You call the police, it won't get you anywhere." Funnily, when I then took out my phone and dialed the non-police emergency number on speakerphone and made a police report, both of them looked a lot less confident. Big Fat Jane stood there open-mouthed and then grabbed her partner and slammed the door, and we haven't heard from her since. Her partner was placed on suspension due to the allegation and further allegations from our neighbors. He then returned to an admin role. After our confrontation, Big Fat Jane was given a warning for public order offense. However, due to a number of reports, her daycare closed and she is no longer able to mind children. Their house is up for sale. However, as she made a number of modifications without proper planning or works people, its price is significantly lower than they expected and they're in negative equity, all because of a parking space. Isn't it great to call people out on their BS? I mean, sure, you're a police officer. That comes with a little bit of weight, but you don't get to throw that around, especially when you're off duty. You got what you deserved, and so did your wife. Hey, wait, it sounds like you guys are really good for each other. Our last story today comes to us from Chili Racer. Call the cops for you? Absolutely. Let's jump right in. Another shared story about someone asking for the cops to be called reminded me of this. Several years ago, we had some new neighbors move in, a man and a woman renting, and they weren't exactly salt of the earth folks. There were obvious signs of drug and alcohol abuse, playing music so loud that our windows rattled in our house next door, mean dogs that escaped all the time, people over all the time, and parking in the road. You know the type. We tried to be polite but steered clear of them whenever possible. It was a crappy situation made worse only by the fact that the college kids that used to live there had moved out after years of neighborly bliss. Their parents actually still owned the house, and I had already made a couple of calls to them about the disturbances. I guess it must have been about a year after they moved in when I was driving home from work and headed down our street in a direction where I was passing in front of their house. It was almost dark out, and this was a small residential street with light traffic, and the speed limit was maybe 25 or 30. The man of the house was out in the street stumbling around, yelling, flailing his hands, blocking cars as they were trying to get by. Obviously, he was wasted. He kept screaming for somebody to call the cops. I managed to sneak by him and park in my driveway. I watched for about 15 minutes as he continued this little show. I wanted to watch for any evidence that he was in any sort of jeopardy other than being in the street. So I looked at my wife and said, you know what? He wants the cops. I'm going to oblige. And I picked up the phone and dialed 911 and told them there was a man in the street blocking traffic and asking for someone to call the police. About 5 minutes later, the city's finest roll up in 2 squad cars. We went out and sat on our front porch and watched them try and get this dude into the back seat for 20 minutes, and ultimately, he was hogtied and thrown in on his stomach by the time they were done. I guess he didn't want the cops after all. We never saw him again, but a couple weeks later, there was a new man of the house that had moved in. We sold and moved a few months after that, but never saw that first guy again, so I have no idea what happened. I can only presume he had outstanding warrants and was locked up. Wait a second. College kids and neighborly bliss in the same sentence. What the heck? That being said, I'm sure there are some wonderful college kids who are great to be your next door neighbors, but that's not something I've ever seen. Check out all 4 OPs listed in the description down below. I thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.